Max Payne 3 is an all-time great for me. It's a game I hold very near and dear to my heart due to the time period it came out in, and I find myself going back to it quite often. I was a kid/teen during the Xbox 360 era, so I had no shortage of available bangers to choose from. Call it nostalgia, call me uncultured, or a man who does not know ball, but I stand by the fact that it's still my favorite in the series to this day. Max Payne 3 was actually the first Max Payne game I ever completed. I played the first Max Payne at my godmother's house when I was like 7 years old, and I remember that first mission where the junkies break into Max's home had me shaking in my boots, literal fecal matter ready to explode and paint my leg at a second's notice, because to a 7-year-old me, in my mind, they looked like Baraka from Mortal Kombat, except he was wearing nurse scrubs. Something about the vibe of Max's home, the cries for help, the tweakers, and the camera angles really had me on edge as a kid. Needless to say, I could never finish the game past the train station, so
I guess I'm just a pussy.
for a long time, I had no reference to make comparisons to when it came to Max Payne 3. I thought it was just a fun, third-person shooter with a great score, iconic voiceover narration, stellar gunplay, peculiar visuals, and a decent story. It didn't really go any farther than that for me at that age. I didn't browse the internet much, so I had no idea as to how the game was received online by fans or players alike. It wasn't until I got older and built a PC that I finally went back and played through the old games to see what I was missing out on. And to my surprise, I came out with an entirely different outlook on the franchise in that we were robbed of a true Remedy Max Payne trilogy, which is hard for me to admit, but when you go through those old games, you can't refute how much of a departure the third game was in comparison to the first two. A lot of this can be tied to the fact that the third installment was actually developed by Rockstar Studios, whereas the first two games were developed and written by Remedy. So in 2002, the Max Payne brand was sold to Take-Two as they were wrapping up development for the second game, and despite the momentum of the Max Payne games, the Max Payne franchise stayed dormant until March 23rd of 2009, when Rockstar officially made the announcement that the third game was in development, and was expected to release in the winter of that same year, although it would not be released until 2012. It's no secret that Max Payne 3 was in developmental hell throughout that 3-year stint, with multiple story rewrites, long delays, and the time crunch that was put on the development team, all of which is heavily covered on YouTube, and you should definitely check it out. I believe it's important to mention this as it leads to some kind of explanation for the direction Rockstar took Max Payne 3 into. And it's mainly when I look back on the story. I really have no issues with the story on its own, but there is something that stands out to me that I can't ignore, which is the fact that Max Payne 3 really is like Man on Fire the game, the film from 2004 with Denzel Washington. I'm ashamed to admit that when I first made the connection between Man on Fire and Max Payne 3, I low-key thought I may have been the first person to discover this. Yeah, not gonna lie, I really thought I was cooking here. And when you don't have anyone to bounce ideas off of or do any prior research, these are the consequences of your actions. Not only was I not the first person to come up with this comparison, but when the first gameplay teaser was released, it was referred to as Man on Fire the game among critics and players alike. Cinema Blend and IGN did an entire piece on the trailer alone, comparing it to Man on Fire. Yeah, needless to say, I'm not winning any awards for originality, but when it comes to the story of Max Payne 3 and Man on Fire, I'm not kidding when I say that the stories and the premise are too similar not to point out. If you don't believe me, just listen to this. Both characters are washed up, former American badasses, taking up a bodyguard position with a wealthy family in a Latin American country. Both men struggle with the burden of guilt and a heavy drinking problem, which they eventually manage to overcome in order to lock in and stand on business. In each story, the girl they are supposed to protect is kidnapped and held for ransom, forcing themselves into the seedy underbelly of the crime and corruption that runs rampant in the cities they work in, where it is eventually revealed that the man who hired them turns out to be the bad guy, or is at the very least to blame for many of the story's events. Story elements aside for a bit, Max Payne 3's visual style was actually heavily inspired by Tony Scott's films from the 2000s. Tony Scott is also the guy who directed Man on Fire. It's a pretty distinct style, but here are some examples. There's these shaky camera movements, distorted visuals, heavy saturation, and these stylistic post effects that they throw into scenes and gameplay, which I absolutely love. A lot of people think it's tacky, but I f*** with it. In many ways, Max Payne 3 pays homage to those action films of the 2000s, so much so that it's hard to unsee how different it was from the first two games. I almost feel like it'd be better in some ways if it fully committed to copying Man on Fire's story to a fuller extent, especially in relation to the wife and daughter in Man on Fire. Now, I'm not talking about some God of War 2018 or Last of Us situation where we have yet another child to be a father to, or where they tag along as some companion, but I am saying that the relationship and bond of the family is what would add an entirely different layer to Max's character, as it puts him directly in line to confront his failure as a husband and as a father, all while trying to save yet another daughter from a similar fate to his own. Personally, as much as I like Max Payne 3's story, I do feel that the angle of having to get the little girl named Peta back from the captors instead of Fabiana, would have raised the emotional stakes even higher for Max, as they would have had a more established connection that we got to see unfold throughout the story, sort of like a surrogate daughter that would run parallel to the child he lost. Especially since Peeta would be around the same age as Max's daughter if she was still alive. As for the wife Lisa in Man on Fire, I will say that she's underappreciated, and actually brings another grounded element to the story that I don't really see talked about, which is that in Man on Fire, there's this unspoken tension between Creasy, Denzel's character, and Lisa in the movie, like Scarface said.
The eyes, Chico. They never lied.
It's not sexual, nor does it lead to some kind of affair, but it is subtle in that it's emotionally charged and not necessarily romantic. Although it's never acknowledged, I do believe it added depth and ultimately added a more personal stake in his revenge. I bring this up because for Max, I believe this fits perfectly, and it's mainly over the guilt he feels over Mona Sachs from Max Payne 2. On one hand, Max feels guilt over his deceased wife that he failed to save, but on the other hand, you'd have Max dealing with how he feels after the death of Mona. In the game, she's only mentioned this one time, but it does reinforce my point about Max feeling guilty.
We'd only been married a short time. By now, she'd been dead longer than I knew her. I still hadn't really forgiven myself for the Mona business, but I knew that was just grief. The insanity that comes with losing the life you had built.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I was kinda hoping for a Mona Sachs gravestone in this mission, like a little Easter egg, but we never got one. I did read Dan Houser say in an interview that they tried to get Mona to work in a subplot, but couldn't make it happen due to it being dependent on what ending players got at the end of Max Payne 2. As depressing as Max Payne's story was in the second game, Mona did end up teaching Max an important lesson, which was to accept that he couldn't change the past, and that the best way to honor his loved ones is to simply remember them and keep their memory alive. I feel like Mona should have been a bigger part of his guilt in the third game, and I would have really liked to see her talked about more. Now, I know it may seem like I'm laying out Max Payne 3 to be an exact replica of Man on Fire, but that's not at all my goal. I mean, to some extent, I do believe certain story elements would work better for the story, but I can't say it would make for a better game if you just copied Man on Fire. No, what makes the video what could have been Max Payne 3 is that I firmly believe that the third game should have pulled more from the Remedy formula we all love with all the bells and whistles of Max Payne 3, in a story that emotionally grounds Max even more so than what we got. Which is why I wouldn't change a single thing about the gameplay or the visual style. For me, it really added to the perpetual haze and fog that follows Max throughout his story, as it helped put you into his shoes and made you a part of the confusion and the situations he finds himself in the strain of subtly being under the influence, or really being under the influence as these events occur. I thought it was done really well, and I also wasn't mad at the more serious, more grounded tone of the game, or the more self-loathing, washed up and less witty Max. In fact, I actually really do like those elements of the game, especially the aspect of Max battling with addiction and seeing that unfold as he's forced to often shoot his way out of situations and often comes up empty-handed, despite his best efforts to the contrary. I also don't think it's far-fetched to believe that the character would have this evolution from a once great hero cop that falls into a broken down, guilt-ridden alcoholic who's past his prime and has a propensity for popping pills after years of substance abuse and trauma. Where I think the Remedy formula comes into play and works best is in the setting and the storytelling. Give me Max Payne in a gritty, dark New York City noir with the poetic monologues that are thoughtfully added in to provide even deeper introspection into Max's character, with graphic novel panels mixed in to break up the cinematic cutscenes and the nightmare dream sequences that clash with the brutal and realistic tone we get in Max Payne 3. Not removing anything outright, but meshing both into a hybrid. The direction of Max Payne's character in the third game has this foundation of the character being more grounded and cynical than the first two games. He's physically broken and carries his guilt like it's strapped to his back. While I don't think it's a mistake to take Max in this direction, I do think it works better if the story has even more personal stakes for Max, as opposed to being like an outsider in Sao Paulo with a family he doesn't have much closeness to, or to the other subplots going on around him. Because if there was one thing they should have taken from Man on Fire's story, if anything, it was the connection to family. Not the kidnapping, not the conspiracy revolving around the boss, but bringing it back to where it all began. I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I think I kind of have a lead on where I want to see Max Payne 3 go. I think we start Max Payne 3 with Max back in New York City in the year 2009, 9 years after the events of Max Payne 2. It's also the year that Rockstar was supposed to release Max Payne 3. Max is now a private investigator after he's been released from the NYPD following the events of the second game. He's washed up, unreliable, and barely holding it together as a detective. Similar to like a Jessica Jones type, if you remember that show. He drinks his way through life, popping pills as he continues to carry the guilt he feels for his family and Mona Sachs. He's lost a few steps, but occasionally splinters of the old Max's wits and sharpness shine through. His reputation precedes him, and this leads to little work, unfortunately. Between that and his pension, it barely keeps him afloat. His only connection to the Force, or the NYPD, is Jim Bravura, who helps him with odd jobs and throws him a bone every once in a while. I know they killed Jim off in the comics, but I need him back for this story, So let's just ignore the comics for now. One night, a widow and her 11-year-old daughter come to Max after her husband, a former NYPD detective, is murdered. The husband was an undercover narcotics officer who was deep into his undercover stint when he discovered something incriminating tied to the NYPD. He said it went deeper than the gangs and even deeper than the police department. But he would never tell his wife what it was that he found. He was killed shortly after, and the NYPD officially ruled it as a gang-related shootout in the papers, but she suspects that the cops are covering up the murder. Every other private investigator she's gone to wants nothing to do with the case, and she suspects it's because they have some sort of connection to the NYPD. Max initially tries to turn down the case, but the widow pleads with him that she needs answers for her husband, and more importantly, she fears retaliation from the corruption within the police department. Max reluctantly accepts the case and throws himself full bore into yet another conspiracy, quickly adopting the hero role and tries to save yet another damsel from a doomed fate. With Max causing more noise as he plunges deeper into the heart of the case, he inevitably puts himself into the line of fire. And his connection to Jim Bravura can only do so much before Max is targeted as well. He begins to get interweaved into the family's life. The child is the same age his daughter would have been, and the wife is a constant reminder of Mona and his wife. They share an unspoken, emotionally charged tension that is never explored, but deep down, Max knows he's trying to right a wrong that he still hasn't learned to accept or move on from. And the reason I'm going with the family is because it serves as like a painful mirror to the family and love that he lost. Protecting them forces him into having to confront those failures as a father and as a husband, as he fights his way through the corruption and deep ties within this conspiracy that killed the husband of this widow. He couldn't save her husband, but he can do everything in his power to save the family from meeting the same demise as his own family, which to me is what would make this story so much more grounded and adds that emotional weight I didn't get enough of in the third game. Because to me, there seems to be this inevitable pit that Max keeps falling into at the start of each game, which is that he always starts off in a place where he's unable to come to terms with grief and loss, coping with it the only way he knows how to, by throwing himself into the action, the booze, or popping pills. Every game ends with Max coming to terms with the same truth, that he cannot undo the past or bring back what has been lost through revenge or action. His only path moving forward is acceptance. Each game differs in tone, but the ending is the same, and for me that's where I struggle with Max Payne 3's ending. It feels like a retelling of Max Payne 1 and 2's ending, albeit more bleak and feels more like a surrender than it does acceptance. Max Payne 1 ends with a sort of dark victory that's earned through revenge, which provides him a semblance of closure from his grief. But in Max Payne 2, the game opens with the revelation that the relief and closure from that grief was temporary, and it still lingers. It treats grief as a spiral and not so much as a linear progression of just getting over it or just some kind of acceptance. By the end of the second game, Max learns a deeper, more emotional form of acceptance that feels more conscious than it does before.
Now, like all my loves, she is mine forever. She has brought me here to this moment of clarity, where time slows down and I choose to look back, to see myself. And in that act of seeing, I am reborn. I had a dream of my wife. She was dead, but it was all right.
So for Max Payne 3 to open and end virtually the same way as the first two games just doesn't sit well with me. I think that if Max's story were to end, it should veer off in the other direction. Make no mistake, Max's final story is about acceptance, but it's accepting that he's incapable of change. If Max's lessons learned in the first two games are that he accepts that the past will never change and that it cannot be fixed through action or revenge, then I would say Max Payne 3's existence alone should tell us that he's never going to be able to accept that truth. He copes with the booze and the pills, but if given the opportunity, he would assume that same hero role and become the unstoppable force that is Max Payne. It's easier for him to return to the crusade. It's easier for him to leave a trail of bodies behind him as he relentlessly pursues this mission to right his wrongs. Think of it. A widowed wife in danger with a daughter in tow practically acts like a port in the storm to Max with this kind of mentality. He feels most alive and in control when he's in the I think in a weird way, Max feels that he honors his loved ones most when he's deep in the midst of exacting his revenge. We know that the right answer for Max is to accept that he cannot undo the past, but I believe that Max Payne 3's story should be that the only acceptance Max Payne has is that he will only ever find peace in the pursuit of trying to change a past that can never be undone. If Max Payne 2 is named The Fall of Max Payne, then I think that the third game is the true continuation of that idea. Max doesn't move on. Emotionally, he's stuck despite being this unstoppable physical force. Saving a widowed wife and a fatherless child allows him to finally save a family through action and revenge. It gives him a chance at living a life that his family was robbed of. And ultimately, I think if he were to die in the pursuit of that mission, it would allow him to finally find that peace, even if it means it'll be within the big sleep. To me, I believe that Max Payne 3 ends with Max Payne going out on a shield. As sad as it may be, I think if done correctly, it would bring Max peace knowing that a family now has a chance to accept and deal with grief in their own way, where they'd be free of violence, free from being hunted, and free from waging a vendetta that ultimately only leaves you feeling just as empty as the day the pain started. I think I would have the game end in a graphic novel panel where Max is on the ground, bleeding out, and he sees the outline of a woman and child in a sunrise, and it fades shortly after, with Max's final words being those of relief and acceptance. Now, while I do think this is way more dark as to how my version of Max Payne 3 would end, I can say that story-wise, it's where I would have liked to see Max Payne go. I toyed with the idea of noir fatalism, a term I recently just learned, so don't go thinking I'm intelligent or anything. And to a certain point, Max Payne does kind of fit that mold. Instead of Max's ultimate lessons being acceptance and growth, it's actually that he's defined by his grief and the violence until there's nothing left of Max at all, or until that violence eventually kills him. I don't think he was ever going to be able to release that grief until he met his demise, because no matter what he does or tries to change, all roads lead back to the day he lost his family and the chain of violence that followed along with that. It's kind of like no matter what happens, Max was doomed from the beginning. And as gloomy as it is, I kind of think it's poetic to see a man almost break that chain or cycle by finally saving someone that legit couldn't have survived without him, much like his family. It's like through sheer will, he made it happen. Who's to say how the family would handle grief afterwards, but we're here to talk about Max, not some family. Like I said before, I love Max Payne 3, and I think there's some really good stuff in there that is severely slept on. But when I think back to Max Payne 1 and 2, I can't help but think what could have happened if Remedy never had to sell Max Payne in order to spread their wings and afford to work on other projects. Maybe one day I'll ask Sam Lake himself if I get the chance, but until then, it just makes me think of what could have been.
I don't make no moves unless my heart is in it. Everything had changed when my mind started shifting. It's always up to you and that's from start to finish. They don't wanna see you win cause that's just hard to witness.